Hi everyone, this is Coming to Peace with Science, and I'm Daryl Falk. In some of our other videos, I've posed two hypotheses of how our species came into being. The first, hypothesis number 1, we'll call the creation from scratch hypothesis. The second, hypothesis number 2, proposes that God created through the evolutionary process. Hypotheses can be tested by examining the predictions that they make. Hypothesis number 2, creation through the evolutionary process, makes a highly specific prediction. In this video, we'll examine this prediction. Then we'll test it and see if the prediction is borne out. But first, some background. You came into being, of course, when the genetic information from your father fused into a single package with that of your mother. Because of this, if you analyze your genetic information, that is your DNA, half of it would match your mother's, and the other half would be a match to that of your father. From each parent, you carry 3.2 billion bits of code, or bases of DNA. That's 6.4 billion altogether, and they're almost a perfect matchup of one parent or the other. Notice I said almost perfect matchup. It's not quite exact. On average, of the 6.4 billion units of code that are used to build your body, we would expect that 77 of those 6.4 billion bits have changed from that of your parents. In order to make the sperm and the egg that gave rise to you, the DNA of your parents was copied. And although the copying mechanism is almost perfect, there are an average of 77 errors that are made each generation. The errors are called mutations, and the rate at which they occur has been studied extensively. The average rate is remarkably similar over time, although I do want to add this as a little aside, and that is that in any specific circumstance, the number of mutations is affected by the father's age. Still, the average remains similar in study after study, 77. What this means then is that if we go back 2 generations, you would have about 154 differences that weren't present in any of your 4 grandparents. And there would be 231 differences from that of your 8 great-grandparents. Now that's not going back very far, just 3 generations, but already there are 231 changes in the code, the bases of DNA, that are unique to you and not present in any of your great-grandparents. If we go back 10 generations, that would be back to the year 1750 or so, there would be about 1,024 different people from whom your genetic makeup is descended, and approximately 770 bases would have changed. Much work has been done to check the mutation rate over time, and there is very strong evidence that shows that the average remains quite constant, varying not more than 2-fold. Let's get back to testing hypothesis number 2, that God created through the evolutionary process. If indeed God created humankind through descent from an ancestral species that we share with chimpanzees, there would have been mutations occurring all the way back through time. Copy errors occur. We know how often. That should hold true all the way back to the common ancestral species that we share with chimpanzees. So let's test that prediction. How many generations does hypothesis number 2 predict that there has been since the common ancestor? Well, looking at the fossil record, as we go deeper back into time, we find fossils with bodies looking less and less like ours, and more like the ape ancestors that hypothesis 2 predicts. In examining this change in the fossils, paleoanthropologists put the date of our last common ancestral species with great apes as recently as 5 million years ago. Others place it further back, perhaps as far back as 10 million years. For the sake of illustration, at least at the start, let's say 5 million years, and let's estimate a generation time of 20 years. That would mean about 250,000 generations. Rather than examining all 6.4 billion bases, we're going to analyze a representative sample. In one study, the sequence of almost 2 million units of code was compared in humans and chimpanzees. It was 1,944,102 that were compared in chimpanzees versus humans. And so how similar were they? Well, it turns out in that almost 2 million units of code, there were 24,165 differences between the 2 species. That's 1.24%. And this percentage, 1.24, is similar to what we find for single base differences in the genome as a whole. So our sample of 2 million or so bases is a representative sample. So what is the number of changes that would be predicted if there were 77 changes per generation over 250 250,000 generations altogether? The answer is 13,181, and that's assuming 5 million years since the last common ancestor. So that's one possibility. Let's check another. If the last common ancestor lived 10 million years ago, the number of differences would be expected to be 26,362. For scientific details on how these calculations, please see the references down below. So hypothesis number 2 predicts between 13,000 and 26,000 changes in the code if the last common ancestor lived between 5 million and 10 million years ago. That's the prediction. The actual number of observed differences is 24,165, so it's between 13,000 and 26,000, just like one would expect. It's an amazingly close verification. Hypothesis number 1, creation from scratch, makes no prediction, so we can't test that directly. However, it certainly would turn out to be a fantastical coincidence if, in creating humans from scratch, the number of genetic differences corresponded exactly to the number expected if there were 77 mutations occurring per generation for 250,000 or 500,000 generations. Still, there is another, even more precise test of hypothesis number 2 that we can carry out. What if we do more than count up the differences between chimpanzees and humans? What if we characterize the nature of the 77 changes that occur each generation, and then compare that to the nature of the genetic differences that exist between chimpanzees and humans? What prediction does hypothesis number 2 make? And is the data consistent with that prediction? More on that in part 2. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to be notified of the next video in the series, click on the subscribe button and the little bell beside it.